All right, so yes, we can. So thanks everyone for joining us. This is a combined event by the Science and Society Network and the Culture, Environment and Science stream at ADI. And I would like to start first by acknowledging that we are gathering here in the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of this land. And we pay respect to the local people for allowing us to have our gathering on their land. And it's a great pleasure to introduce the speaker of today, who is from Canada here for a few months as distinguished professor, visiting professor at ADI, that's the title. My good friend, Professor Stephanie Lloyd. So very few words about our research. So Stephanie is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Université Laval in Quebec. And she works at the intersection of STS and medical anthropology. Her two main areas of research are ethnography and narratives emerging from neuroscience and epigenetics about neurobiological risk and suicide. And the second area is perceptions and experiences of hearing through cochlear implants from the perspective of neuroscience and audiology researchers and CI users. So she brings a very excellent combination of social science, culture, and science and technology expertise, plus lots of ethnography with key scientists. So it's a pleasure to have her here introducing and presenting the talk. Please, Stephanie, I'll leave the floor to you.
Computer. Okay, thank you for the introduction. And again, thanks to the SSN and the CES for the invitation, and to the ADI for providing me with the opportunity to come here, extend my research and my collaborations with people in Melbourne. So the talk today is Deafnesses, reassessing experiences of deaf hearers. I'll dive right in, and you'll see how these keywords recur throughout the presentation. So this is research that I began back in 2017 with collaborator Michelle Friedner from the University of Chicago. So what we were interested in together was the gray zone between deafness and hearing, occupied by deaf people who use cochlear implants for auditory input. So to date, the work that we build on was situated in deaf studies and anthropology of disability, and often grounded in a culture versus technology framework. While we share the interest of these researchers about the historical shifts within the deaf communities, our point of departure is different. So our question was, if many deaf people now use CIs to access sound, what is the experience of being a deaf hearer? Moreover, what is known and unknown about these experiences? What assumptions about these experiences are built into devices and therapeutic infrastructures? And how might we mobilize different forms of evidence to come to know deafnesses in the plural differently? So I'll be addressing these issues, which reflect the earlier research that Michelle and I did, plus some emerging research through 5 topics. The first will be really an introductory section on placing the CI within a long history of interventions that have sought to cure the sensory deficit of deafness. I'm going to then take a step back from the technology to look at the therapeutic cultures that accompany implantation and show how an aural approach, and I'm going to be using 2 words here that sound basically identical, aural with an O, and I'll just use Auslan to define them, A-E-I-O-U. There's aural, speech. The one I'm talking, and I'll talk about that sometimes during the presentation, but the other one is aural, A-U, related to the ear and hearing. So I'm going to talk about the aural approaches that accompany implantation and how they've driven the ways in which success with CIs is judged. I'm going to then turn to a body of perception in the third. It says I'm working with my computer. Sorry about that. The third point, which is now on the screen, I'm going to turn to a body of perceptual and developmental research that started to reframe hearing and sensory development in general, and to reconsider how these narratives have been adopted into CI research and clinical practices. In the fourth section, I'll return to the notion of what a good outcome is and how it's defined in these clinical spaces, and in particular, what assessments of normal obscure. And then I'm going to conclude with an area of my research where I would love to hear impact from anyone who's listening, because it's about a new project that we're just initiating, and in doing so, I'm going to take a big step away from the comfortable space of analysis and critique to move on to presentations of the first steps of this project with a group of interdisciplinary collaborators with whom I'm working to actively reconsider deafnesses. So part one, from sensory deficits to impoverished hearing. And again, I'm not going to continually do scare quotes. I'll let you read them into the text sort of yourself. So deafness has historically been framed as a sensory deficit, which from at least the 17th century forward has been intervened on through a range of amplification and other technologies. Over time, the auditory input of these technologies has increased, and the technologies themselves have been miniaturized and used by a wider population. So importantly, I'm not going to dive into this long history, but these technologies sought to increase access not only to sound, but also to communication, verbal communication. So right from the start, in these technologies, normalization on multiple was aimed for on multiple levels as the goal of auditory prostheses. Moving on to the CI, and more recent technologies. Over the last 30 years, the variety of devices available to people who choose to hear has proliferated, from very, very small digital hearing aids to CIs, cochlear implants, to brainstem implants, and hybrid biological technological devices that are still in development. At the same time, the number of people using these devices has risen considerably. And we can talk about that later, but cochlear implants themselves are being used amongst a very wide range of people, from infants to elderly to single-sided deafness, etc. The CI, for its part, is considered one of the first true bionic devices and the most effective neural prosthesis developed, considered to either create or recreate the sensory experience of hearing. So the device is fundamentally different from amplification technologies. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it, so just a very quick overview. It functions by means of an external sound processor, generally worn on the ear, which converts incoming sounds into an electric signal that goes through the head and stimulates a surgically implanted electrode array in the person's cochlea. The electrodes then activate different regions of the frequency-sensitive cochlea, or it's a tonotopic organ. And the stimulation is transduced to nerve impulses in the body's auditory systems. And from there, it follows the same path as it would in anybody without a cochlear implant. But despite the CI's renown, a language of lack pervades descriptions of hearing with the devices. Impoverished and degraded are common terms throughout the medical and clinical literature to describe both the signals sent by the CI as well as the resulting sensory experiences. So I'm trying to bring out these two different points, because hearing with CIs is then rhetorically positioned as simultaneously more than deafness and less than typical hearing. And by typical, okay, no problem. And I'm using typical to generally avoid the connotations of the word normal, but it would refer to acoustic hearers. So this reflects the ambiguous place of the devices in long-standing portrayals of deafness as still a sensory deficit. And these representations affected by the CI is considered to be from neurobiological to experiential levels, and each considered to be lacking compared to typical hearing. So, in response to these perceived deficits of hearing through a cochlear implant, therapists have sought to normalize the sensory of CI users through intensive training focused on learning to listen and hear like typical hearers, behaviorally through minimal lip reading, and neurocognitively, measured through spatial and temporal neural processes. The goal of the CI, the goal of these therapies is to maximize the auditory input from the CI and maximize use of it, with the underlying idea that if this does not happen, the auditory cortex is at risk of takeover by the visual cortex due to cross-modal plasticity. And I'll return to this a little bit later, the competitive model. Importantly, if hearing with CIs continues to be understood through a framework of deficits, they're nonetheless associated with quote unquote good outcomes. These outcomes have come to be associated, most particularly in clinical and education settings, with normalized speech and the ability to pass for typical hearers. Normalized speech has come through these processes to be taken as a stand-in for normal or normalized hearing. And so it's in this way throughout this history that a stand-in speech for the distinctive sensory process of hearing with a cochlear implant has come to be seen as an end unto itself. Speech is enough. You don't need to understand what's going on. So then to sort of close this little introductory section on how we can situate the CI within a specific history, they're in a long series of efforts to intervene on deafness and are associated with a specific set of ideas and practices oriented towards normalization, habilitation, and potentiality. Anthropologist Michelle Friedner has explored how these ideas suffuse surgeons, CI manufacturers, families, speech and language pathologists, among others, orientations to CIs. These people argue that with timely CI surgery and appropriate habilitation, deaf children can become normal hearers and that they can develop on par with or exceed their developmental and hearing peers in terms of language and social skills. Habilitation is an important word here because it's distinguished from rehabilitation in that the former is the development of a new ability or the maximization of one's potential rather than a return to a previous state of functioning. Friedner argues that habilitation is a process and practice in general that foregrounds the ways that potentiality attaches to certain kinds of devices, therapeutic methods, and people. This is perhaps most obvious in the hopes and expectations of good speech outcomes for CI users, and most particularly in the case of early implanted children. Parents are counseled to implant their kids as the only option. Deafness, the use of sign language, or other possibilities for conceptualizing potential, becoming, or being normal are not provided as options, Friedner writes. So from the perspective of these professionals, successful personhood remains contingent on a narrow definition of communication, sensory, and social potentiality. So I draw on Friedner's work because it captures the desire of the clinical and educational infrastructures accompanying CI programs to produce children who can escape the category of disabled by becoming listening, speaking, and independent people. I draw on her ethnographic contributions throughout this talk to consider how normative ideas of potentiality and habilitation have also foreclosed a consideration of the sensory processes that might otherwise be studied or reproduced or produced through the use of CIs. So, setting aside CIs for a moment, I want to briefly look at the specificity of the therapeutic infrastructures aligned with the devices, as these are essential to understanding the narrow framework within which habilitation with CIs is conceived of. So, current therapeutic interventions that accompany CI implantation are often based in auditory verbal therapy, or AVT. It's an acronym that will come back over and over, orientations, whether explicitly or not. AVT grew out of an approach developed in the US in the 1970s called auralism. Here we have the AU. It was described as the third way and proposed by American educator John Croft to circumvent tensions between auralism and manualism. Croft argued that neither auralism nor manualism could teach an individual with only 4 senses to compensate well enough to compete successfully in the world where others have 5. To achieve this 5-sense normality, people with reduced hearing levels were trained to strengthen only their auditory sense. So this hearing only or unisensory approach grew throughout the 70s and 80s, alongside the development of increasingly effective auditory prostheses. The movement became institutionalized in the late 70s with the International Committee on Auditory Verbal Communication, and as of 85, you could become certified as an AVT therapist that would reflect the specificity of your approach and distinguish you from people who were auditory and auditory oral approach, in which you could still use visual signs like lip reading. There are about 1,000 of these people certified throughout the world, mostly in the North, although they're extending their reach throughout the world. But this number is a little bit deceptive because really these approaches dominate CI habilitation, whether people are formally trained or not. Just to give you a sense of what is embedded, the values embedded in AVT, I'm going to rapidly list off some of some characteristics of the 10 principles for AVT specialists. It's to promote early, and you'll notice it's repetition, promote early diagnosis of hearing loss in newborns and immediately follow with audiological management and AVT. 2, recommend state-of-the-art hearing technology to maximize the benefits of auditory stimulation. 3, coach and guide parents to help the child to use hearing as the primary sensory modality in developing listening and spoken language. Teach parents to become the primary facilitators of listening and spoken language and participate in individualized AVT. Guide parents to create environments to support listening and the acquisition of spoken language throughout the children's daily activity. As well as 6, integrating listening and spoken language into all aspects of a children's life. To 7, basically mimic normal developmental patterns. 8, they are meant to help the child learn to self-monitor spoken language through listening. And 9, they administer formal and ongoing informal diagnosis to monitor progress and the way that these plans are rolled out in families. And 10, promote education in regular schools with peers who have typical hearing. So as will be clear from this rapidly condensed and presented list of principles, the goal of AVT is to have deaf kids develop alongside their typical hearing peers. And this happens through a regimen of intense training that comes to pervade day-to-day life. It's a family-oriented therapy, and one which includes most particularly mothers who are expected to play very active roles in their children's habilitation. For instance, narrating daily activities to provide language input. Oh, what's that? Would you like a glass of water? Really, it's narrate every aspect of daily life. Reinforcing and continually assessing the specific aspects of hearing and language development. Structuring verbal exchanges through turn taking. Not everyone talks together at dinner. It's only one at a time, too, because this increases intelligibility for people using CIs. Ensuring silence and good acoustics in a house. So it's spatial and really forms of interaction control, because the CI does not function well where there are competing sounds. And finally, it's rolled out in the relations, even with the child. The child is meant to sit on the lap. If you're going to read a child a book, they should sit on your lap facing away from you so that they're not having access, so that you can avoid lip reading in the process. So AVT involves as much a particular way of living as much as a form of therapy. Of note, AVT is considered to work best, or maybe only, depending on who you ask, for young children who do not have additional disabilities. This was summed up by an American audiologist who I spoke to, who explained that these approaches, CIs and AVT, have best outcomes with vanillas. Those kids with the most simple form of deafness, not people with syndromes that affect their development more broadly, people with autism, etc. And one might say it would work best also for vanilla families who are able to mobilize the significant resources financially in terms of time to work toward the normalization targeted in this unisensory approach. So as such, AVT needs to be understood as a highly normative unisensory approach that is grounded in the idea that normal, the CIs, is to be achieved through constantly reinforcing the aural ability provided by the device while sidelining other senses. So let's close that section on AVT and aural approaches. So if AVT played a dominant role in the unisensory rehabilitation of CI users since the 1990s, during this time, a parallel narrative of sensory development was unfolding in perceptual and developmental research. In effect, if sensory elements of the nervous system were throughout the 20th century conceived of in terms of sensory input systems like the eyes, the ears, the skin, that provided information to be made meaningful in the corresponding areas of the brain, providing us with a sense of sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch, emerging research is painting a much more complex picture of the sensory system and the traditionally defined senses. In the end, the factors now considered to inform our senses are much more heterogeneous and hybrid than previously thought. So emerging sensory research and the parts that we've been looking at for this project build on perceptual research in the 60s and 70s that they call into question many of the core claims that accompany rehabilitation with CIs. Most fundamentally, this research suggests that bringing a unisensory perspective to bear on sensory processes may miss much of what's happening in terms of sensory processing. Moreover, it suggests that the competitive model of sensory developed implicit or explicit in unisensory approaches, that's when, for instance, they try to avoid lip reading for fear, and especially sign language, for fear that cross-modal plasticity will be mobilized, leading to the visual takeover of the auditory cortex. And you can see there's a whole glut of the articles about this at a certain period of history about CIs. So the emerging research suggests, to put it bluntly, that this approach may be wrong. Of course, we can nuance this considerably, but I'll leave it there for now. Perceptual researchers argue instead that use of, for instance, audio-visual or multimodal input may develop in synchrony from birth and across the lifespan. So these discussions of cross and multimodal integration are part of broader examinations of synchronous multisensory development and plasticity, seen not as the exception or as restricted to specific populations, but as the rule. Researchers increasingly insist that within the sensorium, a significant number of sensory-related functions are multimodal or supramodal. In effect, functions such as hearing, in quotation marks from this perspective, are informed by multiple senses that together produce coherent information for a person. Depending on the input that people receive, people's supramodal functions are believed to be differentially influenced by one sense or another, to the extent that for some people, this supramodal potential may be partially lost or masked, as in the case of typical hearers who draw less on visual input than deaf people. Compared to typical hearers, deaf people and CI users are considered to draw more heavily on these visual tactile cues and be better at integrating them with the auditory processes and the processes that they use to hear. Of note is that these traits, both material and perceptual, being studied in this research, while sometimes focusing on subpopulations such as CI users, are studied as dimensional rather than categorical. In other words, a trait is considered to correspond neither to, for instance, the trait of a deaf person who does not use CIs, to people who use CIs, nor to the traits of typical hearers, but instead they're considered to be distinct, diverse sensory experiences that cross-cut all these traditionally defined groups. And we'll see this is a trend in this emerging larger body of research. Beyond the perceptual research and this considering of sensory processing, the range of input studied in perceptual and especially developmental research has expanded. Neuroscience, audiology, psychology researchers are interested in a new range of exposures, now conceived of as signals, from family profile to socioeconomic milieu that are considered pertinent to development. So, in the case of language and hearing development, growing up in a quote low socioeconomic environment was recently included alongside hearing loss, language impairment, and dyslexia as contexts considered infelicitous to language acquisition and processing. Specifically, low socioeconomic status, together with other familial factors such as maternal education, are reported to be associated with, and this is a whole series. You'll see the run-on of the reasoning here. With low, they're associated with low language stimulation, which is in turn associated with specific cognitive, behavioral, and neurobiological profiles, which are ultimately associated in these studies with poorer hearing and learning, irrespective of a person's hearing status, meaning whether they're CI users or normal hearers. A lot of this research is being carried out with typical hearing kids. And the framing is the same, whether you're talking about people who are deaf or hearing. These neurobiological profiles, then, are thought to prevent the development of selective attention, seen as a top-down process associated with executive functions, which I'll come back to, which is considered necessary to hear in challenging environments. So we can see sort of the way in which these narratives are being constructed. These arguments are, of course, coherent with broader claims about the negative effects of poverty on the brain. And I'm sure you're familiar with the work of the critiques of Victoria Fitz-Taylor on the effects of poverty on the brain, or the blame the mother narratives, as the critique developed by Sarah Richardson. So from this perspective, hearing is now conceived of as a process that relates not only to what has classically been defined as sensory input, but also to the embodiment of disparate environmental signals. Depending on people's early exposures, these signals are believed to enact themselves on a future sensory trajectory by means of acquired cognitive and neurobiological profiles that affect people's ability to make use of sound. These previously unimagined understandings of hearing have opened up a multiplicity of ways of conceiving of what it means to hear, situating the experience less as a question of deaf or not deaf, and more as a developmental process, and has further blurred the categorical lines already destabilized by fundamental perceptual research. So, so AVT has adapted in light of these findings emerging from sensory and development research, and adopted the language of a signal-based approach. So I'll move back in time a little bit. In 2012, I was at a conference on the current state of scientific research on hearing loss. And a leading American audiologist took the stage and began her presentation with a declaration that, and I'm paraphrasing, our work used to focus on the ear, now that we know that we work on the brain. In other words, it was no longer enough to improve the quality of auditory prostheses and encourage therapies grounded in listening and spoken language. Audiologists now had to concern themselves with how auditory stimulation was made meaningful in the brain to develop spoken language. So while this statement lagged years behind fundamental research, this proclamation by a largely clinically based practitioner and researcher amounted to the identification of a significant transition in terms of how hearing loss was understood and interventions were justified. Yet, while justifications of AVT have shifted, little has changed in the orientation of the intervention. The hearing brain, which is now the target of AVT, could be described as reflecting a 20th century understanding of the ordinary communication line, or a direct relationship envisioned between sound and the brain. Culture and communications researcher Jonathan Stern has described this as the telephone theory of hearing. So in other words, if previously AVT specialists aimed to optimize listening and hearing by adding sound to the ear, language and development, now they aim to do so through the brain. And in these approaches, language and speech development remain unambiguously the goals of therapy. While AVT specialists have made concessions to evidence of the adaptive value of multimodal sensory input, for instance, allowing kids more access to see the lips of the people carrying out the therapy and the language training. In the past, they'd use screens to cover their mouths. Not all the time, but sometimes, certainly. Other characteristic aspects of the therapy have been really redoubled. Among these are the intimate and family-oriented approach of AVT, which is seen, and this emerging research is seen as that these orientations are further justified by signal or environment-based models. For instance, signal-based or research is now being used to justify clinical interventions that would target low socioeconomic status families to improve the presumed low auditory input within those contexts. So AVT then remains decidedly vanilla, a vanilla approach in which habilitation associated with CIs remains oriented towards harnessing already targeted forms of potentiality grounded in normalization, and in particular through speech. So moving on to normal and what normal obscures. The question is, what's at stake in this narrow form understanding of normalization? So though perceptual and developmental research has to a great extent complexified how we might understand sensory experiences with CIs, normal outcomes with the devices are still routinely assessed through speech outcomes, both receptive and expressive, so what people hear and what they can say. The clinical and research preoccupation with speech has the effect of obscuring other measures of normality. So what other clinical signs or states could be read as a normal outcome with a CI, from a biological to an experiential level, as well as a more expansive view of normativity, so ways of living beyond those oriented towards hearing and listening and speaking. So in effect, if normalization of speech is seen as an end unto itself, what space remains available to consider the specificity of CI users' sensory experiences? I'm going to go into some really sort of nerdy scientific details here, but it's kind of necessary to understand how different this process is. Because though we've moved beyond traditional categorizations of sensory profiles, now decades of research in psychoacoustics and auditory neurosciences have demonstrated that experiences of CI users are different in specific ways from those of typical hearers, even if their speech outcomes are similar. So briefly, the first one, the difficulties hearing in loud environments. Researchers suggest that this first difference results from the specificity of the device. CIs have 12 to 24 electrodes to receive the electrical signal that carries sound information from the external sound processors to convey it to the auditory nerve. This is compared to the 30,000 sensory hair cells in a typical cochlea. Given the particularities of the CI's internal components, because you really just can't fit many more electrodes in there, early in the development of commercial CI, engineers opted to severely quantize incoming sound frequencies. So they squished a whole bunch of frequencies together. And they used filter banks in external processors to reduce incoming information on the sound, as they believed that the electrodes would not be able to detect small variations in sound frequencies. So for those of you really interested, these are the fine structure cues on harmonics, the little changes within a single sound. The devices also send less precise timing information, without which people with CIs tend to draw on loudness to locate speech and sound. Whereas if you were talking to me, I would understand you were over there by the shadow effect of my head. But the CIs can't work that fast. So people with CIs draw on what is the loudest thing, and that must be the important one. So this leads to significant problems, especially in noisy environments. So these discrepancies between hearing with CIs and a typical auditory system lead to very different experiences of sound. In terms of the second point, emerging research suggests that CI users tend to draw on different cognitive processes to make sense of, for instance, language. For instance, they tend to rely more on top-down rather than bottom-up processes to hear. Use of top-down strategies effectively means that CI users need to think more about what they hear to decode language, using contextual cues. What was the sentence about? Linguistic competence, how many words they know, how they can pick words apart, even if they didn't hear the whole thing, to complement the signal sent from the device. In comparison, the more typical bottom-up processing relies less on recourse to thinking to process the sensory input. This has resulted in the interest in the executive functioning and that whole cascade of the effects of home environments on the brain that I spoke about earlier. So in terms of the final point, differences in the peripheral hearing systems, much thinking about CIs and how people might experience the input of CIs is based on people who have lost their hearing and subsequently used the devices. An engineer I spoke to as a part of this project, who built several generations of the CIs, including the first commercialized one, described how late deafened CI users might use the input from the device through a visual analogy. He started by talking about how, okay, even if we have an image, we reduce the pixelization, we're still able to figure out what the picture is because the brain fills in what's missing. While logical, this explanation still leaves a lot to be understood about the experiences of people who transition from acoustic to electrical hearing. But this is as far ahead as a lot of people are in their thinking about this. Then we switch to another population. In terms of people who have only ever heard through CIs, people who are congenitally deaf, for instance. I asked, he hypothesized using the same example as the response. What is it? And he's talking about a picture with a highly reduced pixelation. Doesn't look like anything, because the people with CIs coming at it from the other direction. They don't have an idea what it could be, having never seen the fully pixelated version. So, the brain is able to put it together. I think it's something like that happens. The brain is really good at making up stories and putting it together. Following his analogy, I asked whether he thought maybe the brains of people who have only heard through CIs might put the picture together differently, with the effect of understanding sound quite differently from acoustic hearers, despite the fact that they might reproduce the same language in quote unquote normal ways. And the engineer just replied, well, I suppose, yeah. And so these are the very significant discrepancies in the sensorial normality underlining the apparent normativity, the speech-based normativity that is measured in standard interventions with CIs. And we can see from this swath of details how many things are really being obscured about these experiential processes. Okay, more details. So my point here is not that normal, passing, integrating, having good outcomes. My argument is that is not that it's of no importance, but rather that it's at least as important to understand how people get there or not. I would suggest that we've accumulated more than enough knowledge to move beyond normative approaches to habilitation with CIs and to consider the experiences of deafnesses, to draw on the term proposed by historian and media scholar Study Mara Mills, and the accompanying range of experiences associated with deafnesses. So consideration of this broader category is grounded in technological, political, and social landscapes and challenges narrow notions of potentiality, as well as ideas of cohesive, homogeneous communities, while at the same time opening up new ways of thinking about sensory processes that may in the end have more to do with neurodiversity than deafness. And here I move on to the more speculative part of the project, the moving forward steps. So I ask, how might we begin to understand sensory experiences of CI differently? And this is what I'm trying to undertake currently with a group of really excellent interdisciplinary researchers to understand the sensory experiences with or without CIs differently, to challenge current habilitation practices. So this is very prospective, but this is how we're thinking we might be able to address it. Please tell us what you think. So in this project, which is just getting off the ground, it's based in a deaf gain model. And it's an asset-based approach that focuses on how deaf people want to make sense of the world, make sense of sensory input and communicate. And it's guided by the principles of design justice. We adopted these approaches to ask what deaf people want from CIs and how their hearing and other sensory experiences should be understood. So in doing so, we're building on the work of disabled human-computer interface researcher Cynthia Bennett. And the project is grounded in a collaborative model to replace the traditional user tester in assistive technology design. In that sense, you would bring in the participant, get some feedback, do some tests, send the participant on the way. The people using or no longer using cochlear implants are an essential part of this process. So these are sort of the steps we're laying out. So in addition to the more traditional social sciences and humanities approaches, as in the first 2 points, such as oral history interviews with deaf people with or without cochlear implants, and oral histories with clinicians and scientists to trace the way in which they understand the experience of deafness and how this has an impact on the way they practice or build things. We're trying to actively confront different forms of evidence. Key among the approaches to do this will be a process called audiological narratives with CI users. We're going in this process, they'll narrate their perceptual experiences alongside a consideration of objective evaluations of those same states based on their audiological records. For instance, to what extent are the experiences or outcomes that matter to CI users perceptible in standard clinical assessments? And that's just one of the whole list of questions, but you get the idea. The project will culminate in the development of case studies with a subset of participants who will work with team members to think through 3 types of representations of their sensory experiences. The first is a merging of narrative accounts and audiological narratives. The second is neurophysiological studies of their responses to sound. And the third are clinical assessments of their hearing. With an eye still on what's perceptible and imperceptible in these studies or accounts of deafness and sensory experiences with or without CIs, we're seeking to understand what is meaningful, what's important, what's enjoyable, what's difficult, what's irrelevant in all of these accounts of deafness or using CIs. So in what way are they meaningful to CI users or past users, and to discuss their sensory experiences. So through these processes, we're interested in how CI users' accounts will provide insights to critically examine normative frameworks for rehabilitation practices and assessments of outcomes with the devices. So the team driving this research is of fundamental importance. They're here. We have Michelle Friedner, my more long-term, who's a deaf anthropologist at the University of Chicago. So we have anthropologists. We have from sociology, we have Laura Malden, who's worked on disability. She's a certified ASL interpreter. And education, Kristen Snodden, assigning a deaf person who works on questions of integration and educational spaces and the stakes of failing with CIs. We also have literature through Rachel Kolb. You should really look at her amazing interactive piece in the New York Times from a couple of years ago. History, technology, ethics. STS people might recognize the director of disability studies at NYU, Mara Mills. Audiology, deaf audiologist Sarah Sparks, who's really interested in thinking across ASL and communication and speaking more broadly. Rehabilitation studies and multisensory integration, and our token guy and neuroscientist. So through this project, we're trying to bring together all of these people to think differently. The approaches we'll be adopting will be biosocial methodology. For instance, one of the key orientations will be bioethnography developed by Liz Roberts and collaborators, which combines it's a synthetic symmetrical analysis that understands environment-body interactions as always relational and constructed phenomenon. It's really reasoning across multiple types of information. The other approach, and I'll talk a little bit more about that because you might be less familiar with it, is practice-based. It's a move away from evidence-based medicine to practice-based evidence developed by anthropologist Hannah Keisler. It combines insights of practitioners, patients, and researchers to document and measure real-world practices and experiences. It, I quote, tracks and measures what matters, producing knowledge, ways of knowing, and practice through PBE. And this is the important part, in not eschewing the importance of normal, but adding to it. It's not to say that guidelines or scientific evidence are irrelevant. They were just not blueprints for action. So if we want to move forward, we can't stay stuck in the same orientation. Ultimately, and I'm wrapping up here, where the steps of this research serve, and all the methods we've introduced serve as what feminist and disability studies scholar Alison Kafer has called tools of estrangement. to consider whether we're asking the right questions in the first place. Sorry, I forgot to advance. Through these methods, we're hoping to produce new ways of thinking about deafness with or without CIs that challenge the normalizing forms of habilitation. For instance, that assume that normalized speech is a natural measure of a good outcome, with no considerations of the sensory processes that get people there. So in doing so, we want to create a space to consider different forms of potentiality beyond the normative. And final slide. And so if the last one encompassed really the project, this one is sort of a wrap up of the whole talk. In emerging studies, hearing and the hearing brain are understood through audiograms, but also through the embodiment of disparate signals and that are believed to affect exposures to sound waves and how they are processed. While key aspects of these processes differ for people with CIs, the processes themselves are considered to be shared across groups with distinct sensoria. This approach troubles received ideas of normality and reframes the senses and materiality as based on signals. Through these understandings of the hearing brain, we've argued with a collaborator in an article that we're seeing the emergence of a biosocial model of disability. If the social model of disability flipped the script of the medical model's view of disability as something negative to be fixed and instead proposed that it is social, material, and ideological obstacles that lead to the exclusion of disabled people, the biosocial model of disability sees social signals as part of the environment that becomes biologically embedded in a person. Yet, in the biosocial models emerging from perspectives already anchored in CI research, the social is often no more than an extension of the individual or family-oriented factors meant to be harnessed to produce the old outcomes in new ways. Regardless of the intentions of researchers carrying out this work, the effect is often to render certain lives and environments as pathological. Enabling and disabling environments are seen not only as shaping the experience of disability, but instead as materially producing different forms of life and processes such as sensory experiences. These understandings of disability echo developmental studies of the embodied effects of negative exposures from trauma to toxins that tend to proceed by detecting and measuring damage. To cite critical race and Indigenous studies scholar Eve Tuck, that these exposures do to bodies. For deaf people already subject to ableist institutions, discourses, and environments, an enumeration of the embodied effects of a new range of negative exposures only further situates them as living in irreparable states, now envisioned at a neurocognitive level. By contrast, what we're hoping and what we're proposing in working with emergent critical biosocial models of disability grounded in collaborative justice-based orientations, we're hoping they have the potential for new forms of politicization while avoiding the extension of the tragic model of disability into biosocial models of sensory development. The research we are proposing to carry out and have carried out aims to suspend damage and attend to the complexity, contradiction, and self-determination, to document the lives and aspirations of different kinds of sensory experiences and renounce narratives of lack and perspectives of potentially grounded solely in normalization. Therefore, we follow Michelle Friedner and argue for a more expansive and capacious approach to CIs that's inclusive of non-normative life, to foreground the multiple paths for being deaf, disabled, and normal. And we would add of the ideas and practices that shape sensory development and experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. So thanks, Stephanie. It was very exhausting, brilliant talk. I'm not sure if you want to start from people who are remotely connected or...
I always aim to be exhausting. Did you say exhausting or exhaustive?
Exhausting.
Oh, I said exhausting.
Sorry. Exhausting, yes. Shall we start from is there any There is a question from Emma. So Emma Kobal is asking, amazing project and amazing team. I really like the horizon of better than normal conceptualization of deafnesses. Do you think this will lead to better than normal care? And do you think these conceptualizations could help typical hearers hear differently or even better?
Yeah. So there are a couple of answers for that. The thing is that if these therapies really only work for vanillas, that leaves everybody else.
Right.
So anyone whose auditory nerve might not be fully functional, anyone who has irregular physiology in their outer ear, anyone who really doesn't fall into these basic categories because of additional disabilities, thinking differently about different outcomes and possibilities and ways of living in the environment with the cochlear implants can't help but improve for them the way that they're living with these devices, because obviously some people just end up taking them off, right? Michelle has also talked about the whole range of structural and economic reasons why people take them off, because even in Australia they can't afford to repair them as adults. But yes, and the typical hearers, of course, I think that's the idea, and Mara has discussed this. She's discussed it as Mara Mills has discussed this as a double-edged sword with the idea of assistive pretexts. Work that's originally carried out with the deaf population with the idea of helping them, which, it sort of takes me back to the 90s and sort of the pirating of like biodiversity elsewhere to create pharmaceutical products that the local people can never buy. It's the same thing. They do research on all these deaf volunteers and then take that and apply it to typical hearers. It is what it is, but it will, given the way that the models, whether it's in the form of assistive pretexts as described by Mara or not, it will definitely spread over to the way that hearing is addressed.
That's great. So I'm not sure if we have other remote questions, so we can open the floor here for people in the room. I have actually a sort of maybe a bit we take a bit out of your main focus, but I was wondering about two things, Stephanie. So one is the geography of this research, because I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure that I think of Soviet psychology. They might have done quite a lot of work on deafness and blind deaf children. So I wonder, in this story you tell, which is very North American, and even the criticisms are very North Americans, if you would consider a sort of broader geographical scope and looking at different traditions where deafness was conceptualized maybe in a different way than the deficit model. But the other story is that you used a lot normalization, normality, non-normal life, whatever it means. And again, this gives a bit of sense that we are living through a time of intense normalization, right? Or that recent medical work, by recent I mean the last 50, 60 years, has somehow normalized or brought to a view of what is normal, what is abnormal in the deficit model. But again, if you look at the long history of being deaf, you situate being deaf, for instance, again, I know very little, but in the Catholic catechism, there is certainly something about a deaf person is at risk of not understanding the word of God. And I'm sure there were theological debates about this, right? I'm not saying that it was stigmatized. I'm sure another tradition could have been seen as a person with particular power. So I don't want to generalize, but I wonder if this sort of short-term view doesn't lead to an overemphasis on normalization, when instead the story you tell it's a story of pluralizing deafness into very different narratives, including your narrative.
So yeah, I threw in normalizing normality, all those words in here to really show the extent to which we are trying to make it more of a plural story. But I would challenge anyone to Google the A.G. Bell organization, which is the organization for deaf people, mostly cochlear implants. And Michelle has also documented this in her research. Deafness, especially deafness with cochlear implants, is often considered like a feel-good disability. They would have them working McDonald's in India, and it was seen as this great show of integration, because often they're highly functional people Yes, and they're working really hard to pass in all of those environments, but it's often seen as, especially now with all the technologies available, as a disability that's very easily remedied, or even now in Michelle's work, she's documented these people are considered cured. They're not even considered deaf anymore. They're considered to be wholly reintegrated. So yeah, I sort of doubled down on the whole normal thing, but really what we're going towards is this sort of a pluralization and multiple ways of conceiving of it. That may or may not answer the question. The other one was going back in history. How does this come up? Yeah. So in the even Darwin and other people have written about in that era, there was a significant time in the 19th century. There was a significant tying together of the links between being sort of a human and language. And if you didn't have a language, you weren't really human. And so that was a lot at the base of the aural approach to teach people to really sort of reintegrate society and develop that communication that would distinguish them really from animals. So yeah, there is a history here. I haven't found any aspects of them being valorized in the past, but if I missed a part of that question, I'm not sure.
About other like linguistic traditions, I thought psychology, there might be other.
Yeah, so we're with this project because there are so, even, like it's congenitally deaf, late deafened people, people who lost their hearing early and had hearing aids and transitioned, all of these profiles, single-sided deafness, of multiple disabilities, all of these profiles. If we even try to do these 12 extraordinarily labor-intensive case studies at the end of the 5 years, because all of the work will be building towards that. We're not even going to be able to scratch the surface of even what's in the North American context. But the idea is specifically to, in this first phase, start to pick apart maybe some trends, some surprises in this research that then could be followed up in future studies, because already it's very complex. And in terms of deafblind, I actually forgot that. Oops, no, I'm not. Yeah, you can only see my screen. The image here, I'll show you my screen. The image in the ad, this one that I put up on the screen, that's actually from a Great New Yorker article about deafblind communication. So there are Michelle's undergone this training too, which is an entirely different form of communication. It's based on touch, but not signing into someone's hand as was traditionally understood, but full on face, like knee to knee touching and expressing. So they're again, we're not going. Michelle's work is largely based in India, but we're staying largely in North America, at least for these first phases, just because there's so much already to chart.
Thank you. Questions from
fascinating talk, and probably didn't understand all of it, but I'm interested from a sociological perspective, and the fact that you're interested in looking at what deaf people want from CI. And so it wasn't clear. So this category of deaf people is internally differentiated according to the state of deafness, whatever it is.
It's according to, we're going to be recruiting people from all 14 to 100. So really, but what's interesting, so yeah, it will be in part based, we're dividing them there. I didn't mention focus groups and the other thing, but we'll be putting together sometimes people by age, numbers of years of implantation, which could actually sit a 94-year-old next to a 14-year-old. And so where it's based on sort of, we might end up dividing it by type of deafness, and we'll at least try to recruit by that. Whether that will end up being the meaningful category or not, we don't know. The meaningful category might be early career or adolescent. It might be, because of, even with aging, different things become relevant. I interviewed someone the other day who was 70, and she's like, she'd lost her hearing and had really great challenges throughout her life. in terms of trying to, in her professional career because of it. And she's like, I go out for dinner with my friends now, I can hear better than them. So it's really hard to see how these categories are going to sort of filter out, but it will also be based on communication. So Kristen Snodden works on deaf education. She's a signer. Michelle's a signer. So we have well, actually half the team are fluent in ASL or other sign languages, but more than half the team. But so it will be based on communication preferences.
So when you interpret the responses, I mean, the issue about how oneself represents and how others represent them, is that going to be of interest to you in terms of how they, what they want from CI?
Yep. Yeah, I think so, because again, we're anthropologists, so we're interested in sort of breaking down categories, getting rid of the old ways of thinking about this. But to some people, passing as normal might be, and presenting themselves as normal might be the most important thing for them. I'm a lot of the people in the project are deaf. I'm the parent of 2 deaf children, which is why I started working with Michelle as someone who is deaf. All of us, like, recruiting this team was an amazing process. It was like bringing together people from so many different perspectives, because the politics in the deaf community, parents implant their kids before they can consent. If you don't implant them by 2, the implants don't work. They're not going to have those good outcomes. So there are politics even within the team, and the fact that everyone has generously decided to work together around and on these politics is, to me, amazing. So for some people, it might be the way that they're self-presenting, whether that will be most important for teenagers or for elderly people. I'm not really sure. I come from years of anecdotal information. I have a 16-year-old who you might think would be the most self-conscious person in the world, but she also has really big curly hair and attracts headlights. So she spent her whole life with her hair up. She just walks around with her hair up most of the time now. And whereas a lot of other teenagers might just, and I think it's her personality too, but they're very visible, her CIs.
Have you seen the movie The Sound of Metal?
I haven't watched it yet. No, I haven't. So I should, though.
Because it is a counter narrative to all this.
Yeah.
The CI.
Yeah, and it's on my list.
Yeah, that's all right.
But yeah, so the way they present themselves, and we're interested in what might surprise us too.
So we have a question from Tim Neal. So Tim is interested in the trope of bionic ear and whether or not there are or have been, perhaps now abandoned, parallels in relation to other senses.
So for other senses, well, of course, they're trying to. So I've done some work on the bionic metaphor, and so what I've argued in other publications that are under review is that we should just drop the bionic metaphor. It's the idea of a technological solution that has the agency rather than the person. It is imbued with these ideas that it replaces something fully, as opposed to creating something new. Anyhow, so in terms of the bionic metaphor itself, I think it should be dropped, forgotten, cast aside, critiqued. But has it happened in for other devices? I haven't done a lot of work on a wide set of devices. I know mostly the visual, the bionic eye, more than other examples. That I guess they might call it the bionic eye, but it doesn't really. It's a very, sight is an incredibly different system for a whole range of reasons. First of all, the ear stays where it is, the eye moves. So there are all these physical things, but also think about it. The sight, there's no language of sight. There's language that sort of, these are parallel processing systems in the brain that probably coincide in many ways to create the credible outcomes that have been measured with the cochlear implant.
Karina, yes.
I just had a question about research communities. And I wonder if this is different in Canada to here. I know that in Australia, the process of getting a cochlear implant is really long-winded and difficult and challenging. But one of the hardest things that someone I know who's been involved in this process is that there's no center, the doctor refuses to put the client in touch with anyone else experiencing the same sort of very niche experience, maybe of hear loss in 1 year at a certain time of life. And it seems to me that this is one of the most difficult things. And I know that in Australia, they don't do that for ethical reasons. They can't give out other patients' information. But also that is really, difficult, especially when you talk about these sort of like levels of experience.
So let me take you back to the ABT principles. These people should be in mainstream environments with typical hearing. So I can't say that that's what's underlying it, but I think, again, anecdotes, but talking to some parents of kids who got cochlear implants as in their youth, like very young. And the woman herself I was talking to was a doctor, and she asked the surgeon who implanted her son, well, how will I know if it works? He's like, when he marries someone who's hearing. Yeah, so that's that, right? That's sort of, again, it's an extreme example of it. But I do know of some surgical programs and clinics that do provide for teens, for instance, these spaces where they can come together with a social worker to talk about their experiences. But and the AG Bell brings together, and this is a whole other narrative. Michelle's talked about it in the context of India, but the CI stars. And again, these are kids who are extremely high achievers. They're all mainstream. They're all go-getters. And so there are at different levels these communities for people who use cochlear implants. But I guess they're often not based in hospital settings. They're often based in community organizations, and even those they can be sort of conflictual. Recently, I think almost all or most of the older signing deaf people left the AG Bell Association, like in the last 5 years, because they weren't seen as good role models for the kids. So.
We have another remote question from Emma. Again, it's I'm interested in deafness as a feel-good disability. So how does deafness sit within disability/CRIP studies? For instance, does the ability to pass make this particular disability controversial?
Yeah, well, so yeah, it's so that the deafness is a feel-good disability is more in the work of Michelle. But yeah, there are a lot of politics within the deaf community. I know deaf people who grew up in the oralist tradition who then go learn sign language and try to sort of really become more broadly integrated in the deaf community, and they're not very well received. So that's sort of in terms of the people who are able to pass are often not really seen as, I guess, being a part of the community in that sense. And in terms of more like the techno-science manifestos and these approaches, I guess we're trying to push some of these approaches forward, but are they coming from necessarily within the communities themselves? Not as much, because for the people who do well with cochlear implants, it's again a highly mainstreaming thing. But again, to refer back to Michelle and the work of a lot of other people, Laura Malden, the work on sort of the invisible work required to actually pass, and the work required from, in particular, mothers in Laura's ethnography in the clinical environments. There has been more attention to a lot of those elements, the effort to pass.
Other questions, Jack?
Yeah, thanks very much. My question's possibly a bit left field for the paper, but you might be familiar with, I think it was in the 70s and 80s, this study called the McGurk effect, which is got a lot of attention, and I don't know if it impacts people differentially, but you perceive what someone's saying in terms of their lip movements, and so you report hearing a sound which you didn't actually hear. Are there any studies about deaf communities in relation to that experiment, and whether they make similar reports, or are they different in deaf communities?
I have no idea. I'm sorry. Yeah, no, I know of the report. I know of the idea. It's making me also now think about like mirror neurons or something. All of these sort of, but yeah, you know what? That's something I haven't looked into. Like I've read mostly the research on the perceptual research about the multimodal integration of sound and the visual cues, but I haven't gone down that road. I'm sorry.
It's all right. I did say it was left field. So there you go.
Yeah, something to look at for you.
Exactly. I'll have something to do now.
Other questions from here or from remote audience, or any other comment you wish to make?
I think that probably wraps it up.
Yeah, so Stephanie,
But I could, talk for another half hour if you
I'm
want.
sure.
It's Friday afternoon. Why not?
I'm sure you can. Look, that was really a very, very interesting opening. So what are the output you can see in terms of your work now?
What are the outputs? Yeah, you know what? That would be a really, really long coda, because I'm talking about a 5-year plan, but the 5-year plan hasn't been funded. We keep getting 1-year funding, which is fantastic. We keep getting a good chunk, really good chunk of money for 1 year. But what that demands is that we skip to year 5 right away. So in the next year, what our goal is, because we've had 2 of those 1-year fundings now, we are going to try. One year funding was terrifying, because what can we possibly do in 1 year? 2 years, what we're actually aiming to do is take the very well thought out methods that we put forward in the grant proposal, trial them, and then rip them apart in group meetings. And probably our first contribution, aside from regular publications, would be an output on methods, a method-based paper to try to say, how do you actually do practice-based research and bioethnography in the context of neurophysiological data, and clinical data and experiences. So that will be probably, I hope, our next big step. So right now we're just recruiting.
That's very interesting. And anyway, Stephanie is going to be with us in this part of the world until early January. So she's, I'm sure, available for further conversation, correspondence. And why not another final presentation before you go?
Yeah, why not?
Why not? All right. Thank you, Stephanie.
Okay, thank you very
everyone.
much.
Well done.
Thank you.
Exhaustive.
Yeah, and exhausting.
Although on Friday, one can say exhaustive,
I know,
right?
I know.
No, it was great.